friends, it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card using Hello Bluebird's Sea Sentiments, Sea Life, and Sea Friends. So I've stamped those images out on Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock with Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink, and I'm going to be coloring with my Copic markers. I'm starting with my mermaid's skin, and I wanted to go for a tan shade since this is summer. I'm using E00, E11, and E13. So I started with the E13 and began to lay in my shadows up under her hairline, on her neck, on the backs of her arms, and on her waist, also on her ear and the side of her nose. And then I started to blend that out with the E11. Then I'm going to take that E00 and fill in the rest of her skin to give it a nice highlight on her face and the fronts of her arms and her little belly. Then I'm going to bring in a lighter shade, the E000, and color in the shell of my hermit crab. And this time I'm starting with the E11, placing those shadows on the left-hand side, blending out with the E00 and then the E000, and just let that fade into the white. Then I'll come back and do my mermaid's rosy cheeks using R20 and R22. Next, I'm going to work on the mermaid's hair, and I wanted to do something fun. Originally, I was going to go with pink, but then I decided to do a bit of a coral color, almost inspired by my fingernail polish. So I'm using R000, R00, R01, and R02 to start. I wanted to start with really light shades. And for hair, I color different than I do everything else. Normally I color darkest to lightest, but for hair, I like to start with my lightest and build up. That way I don't accidentally get too dark. So I started with the R000 and kind of laid in a few little streaks where I want those low lights to be. And then I went over that with the R00 and then the R01. And now I'm coming in with my current darkest shade, which is the R02, and just deepening up any of those little shadowed areas, adding a little bit around the back of her ear where the hair is kind of swept back, and at the ends of her curls and the top of her head, just trying to follow the lines that are drawn there and do kind of like a sweeping motion. Then I'll come in with my R01 and start to blend that out, and I'll also bring in the R000 and fill in any remaining white space. So it felt like it was lacking a little depth, so I did a second layer off screen. I did that because this is a bit of a longer video since we have so many images to color, but I still wasn't quite happy with it, so I decided to bring in one shade darker with the R14 and just add a bit more definition in those deepest, darkest areas and really make those pop. Then I'll start to blend those out with the R02, just softening them a bit. And then I'll soften that a bit further with the R01, and then I'm just going to leave it as it is. And I really do like how it turned out. It's a very different color combo for me, but I really like it. Then to tie that in with the other images, I'm going to bring in the R17, and I kept the R02 and the R14. I'm going to use those shades for my hermit crab, placing the R17 closest to his shell and coloring in his little side legs. And then I'll blend out with the R14 on his face and his claws and fill in with the R02. Then I'm going to also use these shades to do that little piece of coral up at the top and just add a nice bright pop of red to this card. It's more of like a corally, peachy red. It's not like a super bright like fire engine red, but I think it works really nice in this color palette for summer. So I'm just coloring with the R17 first, blending out with the R14, and then the topmost pieces I'm going to blend out with the R02. Then I'll move on to some green shades, and I'm going to use YG41, YG45, and G46 for my sea turtle. So I started with the G46 on his body, and then I'm also going to use that for his shell, but I'm being a bit more heavy-handed with it on his shell because I want his shell to be a bit darker than his body. And then I'm blending out with the YG45. I really love the way that these three colors look together, and they've got like a soft, almost like a cool tone to them, which I really, really like. So I blended out with the YG45, and then I'm coming in with the YG41 to fill in any remaining space. And I'm also going to use that for the edge of the shell, so it has a little bit of contrast with that lighter tone. Then I am going to continue using these greens and have them pop up in other places on the card with the plant life. So I'm going to do this little seaweed patch or kelp patch, starting again with that G46 and being a bit heavy-handed with it here as well so that it looks a little bit darker than the sea turtle. Then using that YG45 and only saving a little bit of room on this one for the YG41, as I want everything to tie in together, but I don't want it to look exactly the same. So just using a little bit more or less of the darker colors can really change the way things look. Then for the other plant, I'm only going to use the lightest two shades. So I started with the YG45 on the base of each of those little leaves, and I'm blending out with the YG41 on the ends. So now I'm switching things up and going with kind of a muted hot pink. I'm using RV11, RV13, and RV14 for my octopus. So I'm starting with the RV14 and laying a bit of shadow in. This octopus is facing fully front, so the shadows are going to be equal on both the left and the right for the head. And then for the tentacles, I'm just placing them on the top and using the back ones to add a little extra depth by making those darker. I did take off the other cap of my RV13 since that marker always likes to leak on me if I leave it on there. So that just equalizes the pressure in the barrel and just makes it not leak. So preventative measure there. But I blended that out, and then I'm going to come in with the RV11 and fill the rest of the octopus in. The RV11 is quite a bit lighter than the RV13, so I did have to work over it, especially on the larger area of the face. But I do like the way that this combo looks together. Again, I want to tie this color in somewhere else on the card, but not only just among the fish, I also wanted to bring some of these brighter pops of color down toward the lower part of the card. So I'm going to color in this little clam-shaped seashell with these shades as well. Just placing the darkest color where the lines were drawn and then blending out from there. And I'm also going to add this to the fins of one of the fish towards the top there, just starting with the RV14 on those fins, blending out with the RV13, also making sure to color in the little fin on the side of the body. And then I'll use the RV11 on the body, and then I'm going to bring in the RV10 to finish this fish off. And I did go back and add a bit more of that RV11 just to increase that depth, and then blend it out once again. Then I'm going to move on to some yellows, and I'm going to use Y13, Y15, and Y17 to do this little angelfish. I'm going to skip over the two stripes, but I started with the Y17 at the bottom, blended up with the Y15, and then I'm going to fill in with the Y13. I also colored my starfish with this combo, again, so I can bring a pop of that yellow down toward the bottom of the card. And I'm also going to do the droopy fish with this combo, although I'll lighten him up by bringing in an extra shade. So I did veer a little bit away from the original plan. If you missed part 1 of this video, it was the plan a card with me for June. So if you happen to miss that, you may want to go back and watch that, but you can also watch the two videos independently of each other. but we planned out this entire layout together in that video. And I had said in that video that I thought that I was going to go with like hot pink and purple and maybe orange and lime green, and then I ended up just changing the color combos slightly. Really, it was inspired by my fingernail polish. I just was looking at that kind of corally shade, and I thought it would be fun to kind of start with that and then figure out what colors I thought would look good with it. So I wanted to limit this color palette to just the pinks and the green and the coral and the yellow, and then a little bit of the brown kind of neutral tones. So once I started running out of things to color, I did start going back to the previous shades that I had already used instead of introducing anything new. So I did want to do some white stripes on those fish, so I used those really light E shades, but I didn't like it on the droopy fish, so I decided to go back with the green. So I just used the YG41 and the YG45 for that, but I'm also going to do my mermaid's tail in green. So I'm starting with that G46 again and adding in a nice dark line because I want to create some depth there. And then also adding some shading on the tail, on the little fins there. And then I'll start to blend that out with the YG45. And I know I'm going to bring in a lighter shade as well, so I didn't need to go too far. I'm sticking pretty close to the outside edge there still. Then I'll use that YG41, and I'm going to start to color in the little fin at her waist as well with that, and just bring that color out further on her tail and follow the shape of it. And then, as I said, I needed to bring in a lighter shade because I wanted to really have a nice highlight on that. So I'm going to bring in the G00, which also is a very cool toned green, and I think it goes well with that YG41. So I'll fill in her tail with that. And then I'm going to do a bit of detail on that, but I need to let it dry for 30 seconds to a minute. I did also do her little top with the RV14. So like I said, I let that dry for maybe a minute, and then I'm going to go back in with some dot detail with these shades to give it the look of some scales. So I started with that darkest shade, the G46, and placed that where the darkest shading was, and then used the YG45 and then the YG41. And again, I'm just dotting that color in there, and I'm not going to put it in the most highlighted area. So where the G00 is, I just left it because I still wanted it to look really nice and shiny in there. But I did go back and do a second layer with the other shades just to overlap that and really give it that definition and fill it in as much as possible because these colors do obviously dry back just a little bit. And so I'm going back in with that last shade now, the YG41. And then all that's left is that big rock. And I didn't want to bring any gray into this card since we didn't have any gray yet and we had more beachy summery colors. So I decided to just go with dark brown, and I used the E23, E25, E27, and E29. So I just wanted to create a bit of texture on this rock. So I'm coloring kind of adding in some little lines and streaks in there, some shapes to it with that E29 first, blending it out with the E27, then use the E25 and filled in with the E23. I also did want to add a little bit of detail to my hermit crab shell and my conch shell. So I used the E27 to just add like a few little blobs of color there, and then I'm blending that out with the next two shades, and my camera battery died right there, so I didn't quite get to finish, but I did take a black Sakura jelly roll pen after that and go over the eyes of all of my critters that have their eyes open, and also my mermaid. But then I realized that I'd forgotten to give all of my critters their rosy cheeks, so I'm going to quickly do that next. and I'm going back to my R20 and R22. I did a little bit with the R22 first and then blended out with the R20 where necessary. And then one more trick to give this mermaid tail a bit of a shimmer to it is I'm going to take a white Sakura Jelly Roll pen and just add a few little white dots in the darkest highlighted areas there. And I just did that until I liked the way that it looked and kind of softened them a bit with my finger. And then I'm going to trim these images out with their matching dies. For my background, I cut down a piece of Bristol to 5 1/4 by 5 1/4 inches, which is the same size as the Hello Bluebird Ocean Overlay die, which I'm going to place over top now. And I'm going to pick a line and draw that onto the cardstock with a pencil so that anything below that line becomes the sand and anything above that line becomes the sea. And I did do that very lightly, so I hope you can see it on camera, but it needed to be lightly because once you add the ink over top, you cannot erase it. So I can see that line just fine, and that is where I am going to start adding in my first Distress Oxide color, which is going to be Antique Linen, and I'm just trying to place that very carefully along that line so that it kind of follows the curve of the Ocean Overlay die. Once I have the Antique Linen laid in, I'm going to darken that up a bit with some gathered twigs. So I'm going to bring that in from the bottom edge and overlap some of the Antique Linen. And then I will go back and blend those two back together to smooth them out. And then I want to darken that up even further with a little bit of Vintage Photo. And if you watched the Plan a Card With Me video, we planned out all of the inks that we would use for this background then as well. So I'm just darkening up the bottom edge a tiny bit and then adding the gathered twigs to blend that back out, and then one more time with that Antique Linen. I want to do some splatter detail to help that look like sand. So I'm pressing some of the darkest and lightest inks onto an acrylic block. So it's the Vintage Photo and the Antique Linen. And I'm going to add a squirt of water to that and then tap that off the edge of an acrylic block with a thin paintbrush. And I did use a paper towel to cover up the top part because I didn't really want the brown flecks in my sea. So I just covered that up lightly. And once that dries, I'm going to start to work on the ocean, and the first shade that I'm going to come in with is Speckled Egg, because I think the softness of the Speckled Egg is going to transition well from the Antique Linen. The Speckled Egg is more of a desaturated tone. It's a bit muted, and so I think it's going to work okay with the brown. And it's not perfect right where they meet up, but I am going to have that overlay over top, so it's going to smooth out, and I'm also going to do some splatter detail, so it's all going to look nice in the end. But I'm just making sure to blend the transition between those two a bit better, and then I'm going to darken up my sea with the next shade, which is Salvage Patina. And I'm going to bring that in from the top edge and just fill in everything above the Speckled Egg. So there is a lot of surface area to cover there, but I will transition to a darker shade in just a minute. But I'm going to go back to my Speckled Egg first and smooth the transition between these two. Just working my way back and forth between those two colors until I'm happy with how they look. And then once I have the top filled in the way that I want it, I'm going to darken that up with some peacock feathers. And this is a super bright concentrated shade, so I'm only using a little bit of that right on the top edges, and I'm also going to bring it down the sides of it in a second. But I am going to keep working my way back and forth between that and the Salvage Patina until I have a look that I like. I don't want it to get too dark because I don't want the background to be in competition with the coloring. I want it to support the images and colors, but not overwhelm it. So once I'm happy with how that's looking, I'm also going to do some more splatter detail with the lightest and darkest shades, which in this case is the speckled egg and the peacock feathers. And this time I'm not bothering to cover up the sand. If some of the blue gets on the sand, that's totally fine because the sand is also underwater. So everything should have a little bit of a blue cast to it. So I don't mind that at all. And then to make this whole thing come together, I'm also going to do some white splatter. It's going to help it look like bubbles in the sea and like little flecks of, well, glass, because that's what sand is, in the sand. It's just going to help everything look sparkly. So I'm mixing up some Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White with a little bit of water on my acrylic block and tapping that all over the background so I get super fine little splatters. And it's just going to unify the whole thing. So then I'm going to set this piece aside to dry. And in the meantime, I am going to go back to that ocean overlay die and trim that out of some white cardstock. I'm going to tape it into place on the sides and run that through my Spellbinders Platinum 6. And then I just brought the whole plate over so that I could pop out those pieces right near the garbage can. So I'll just knock those out with my fingertips. They pop out super easy. And it's going to just reveal that frame with the little waves running across it, which is so interesting. So now that everything is dry, I'm going to pop my background in my Misty and I'm going to place the overlay over top so that I can figure out my sentiment. I need to curve it to fit the area where I'm going to stamp it. So I'm just making sure that it's going to sit nicely in those grooves. And then I'm going to ink that up with some VersaFine Onyx Black ink. And I'll remove that overlay so I don't accidentally get any ink on it, and then I'll just smooth that into place with my Twiddler's Nook Pressure Pal. I'll ink that up a second time and stamp that down so it's nice and bold. Then I'm going to replace that ocean overlay and I'm going to take some of the small little fish images and I'm going to stamp those on the background so that they just kind of fill in some of the areas that will be empty, that don't have images, but they also create a bit of depth because they're going to be dark in the background, and so it just looks like they're swimming further away. And I'm going to stamp those down with some Uncharted Mariner ink since I'm stamping right over Distress Oxides. And they're just a bit darker than the peacock feathers, so I think that they create a nice silhouette. So I stamped out a bunch of those and then I can set that aside and I'll pop my card base in my Misty. I trimmed down a piece of Lawn Fawn Tide Pool cardstock to be 5 1/4 by 10 1/2, and then I scored it in half so it's 5 1/4 by 5 1/4, and I'm stamping on the inside in Fish Tank ink. And now I'm ready to start assembling. So I'm going to take the ocean overlay and add a thin bead of glue along the edges of that frame with my Barely Art Precision Craft Glue. And then I'm also going to add just a few little dots here and there along those lines so that it will be secured down. But I didn't cover them completely. I don't mind if it lifts up in a few little areas. It just kind of adds a bit of a drop shadow then and gives it a nice effect. But I did want it to be like secure. So I am lining that up with the background and smoothing that into place. And then I'll glue this whole piece to the front of my card base, making sure to just line up those corners so that I know that it's on there nice and straight, and smooth that down. And then I can bring in my images. So I'm just going to glue my images flat to the card. Since this is a square card, it costs a little bit extra to mail, and there's special stamps that you can use for square cards, and so I didn't want to also add bulk with foam tape. So I'm just going to glue everything flat to the card with my liquid glue. So I'm laying out some of my biggest images to kind of figure out the placement, making sure I have everything where I want it. And then I can lift those up and start to adhere those down. So I'm just sliding that rock back behind the mermaid, and then I can add her over top so it looks like she's sitting along the edge of that. And then before the glue on the rock has time to dry, I also want to slip one of these plants back behind it. So I'm just going to tuck that behind the rock and the edge of the mermaid's hair. And then I'm going to add the sea turtle right in front of her so she can be interacting with him. I love that little sea turtle. He's so cute. And then the octopus I'm going to put towards the top left corner. So once I have those main images adhered there, I can start to work on the bottom. So I'm just figuring out where I want to put this little coral. The hermit crab I knew was kind of going in the middle, but I wasn't sure where I wanted the coral and the plant to go exactly. So I'm just figuring out the placement of everything. Again, trying to spread that color around the scene a bit more. So I decided to put the red coral over near the rock and just kind of break up that large chunk of brown right there a bit. And then the green plant I'm going to place over on the left hand side, and it's kind of blocking in that sentiment, having something that's framing it on the left and then the mermaid tail on the right, so it kind of draws even more attention to the sentiment. So then I can work on my other large images, which are the rest of the fish, and just figure out their placement. And once I'm happy with those, I can start to adhere them down. Just placing the pink fish the farthest away from the octopus to spread that pink around the scene and just pull your eye here and there to different points. And then I have the two yellow fish facing each other. And then all that's left is the little seashells. So I'm just going to create some little clusters here underneath that green plant. I'll also put the conch shell over by the coral, creating a little cluster over there. I've got my starfish and also this little nautilus looking shell, and I still have to adhere my hermit crab. So I'm just going to glue him down and finish with these last few little things. I'm really happy with how this little scene turned out, and especially with the color palette. It's not one that I've ever done before, and I feel like it turned out really summery, which I love. So anyway, I'm going to take some Stardust Stickles and add that here and there to the card. I did it on the fins of the fish, the stripes on the angelfish. I'm going to add a little bit to my clamshell and my starfish, and I just had to fix that because the glue wasn't quite dry there. I also added it to the stripes on my nautilus. I added a few little dots into the mermaid's tail and some little lines on the fins. And then I also decided to put it in my mermaid's hair. So I'm kind of just dragging that where the darkest streaks are, adding a little extra accent there. And then I just straightened up the card to take one last look and decided to add some to the turtle shell as well, since that's right in the center of the card. And I decided to call it quits there. I didn't want to overdo it. So I'm going to lift that up so you can see all of the detail and hopefully catch some of that shimmer and shine. And I'll give you another peek at the inside. I really hope you guys enjoyed this one. I had so much fun creating it, and I have already planned out another mermaid card because I just love mermaids so much, and these images are just so sweet. If you did enjoy it, please be sure to hit that like button and leave me a comment down below. I'd love to hear from you. Subscribe if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell if you want to be alerted whenever I post new videos. All of the products I use will be listed and linked in the description bar below, and if you'd like to keep watching, here are 2 extra videos I thought you might also enjoy. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. I hope you had a good one, and I'll see you soon in another video. Bye-bye!